You spoke about the podcast, about how it isn't virtuous to be a bullied nerd. Yeah, so this was on a couple episodes ago. I was talking about the never-ending story and this trope, this narrative trope that we have, that the bullied nerd turns out to get his, justification in the end, and the bullies are lame and they, never amount to anything, right? I was wondering how our culture came to glorify this trope, and hence the rise of victim culture. The first thing that came to mind was the Beatitudes and similar Christian doctrines like turn the other cheek. I believe Christianity has been a net good to society, but in this subject, it seems to have gone too far. How can our culture recover from this attitude of glorifying the downtrodden? Just being nice to people and raising good kids doesn't seem to be slowing our slide into the craziness. Is every culture just doomed in the end, so it's not worth worrying about? Well, it's funny. I actually talk a little bit about this in the book that, every culture is doomed in the end, and nobody knows where they are in the cycle of regimes. The owl of Athena flies at dusk. You can only tell history in retrospect, right? So there is a level in which, like, what's going to happen is going to happen, and it's not your job to save the world. It's your job to save the West, which is to say to preserve in your family, in your sphere of influence, in your heart, the true, the good, and the beautiful principles that have been passed down for generations. That's your job. It's not your job to save the world or even to save America single-handedly, right, from disaster. But that doesn't mean it's not worth worrying about, because you do have a sphere of influence and you personally have, truth matters. It matters to know what is true. And even if eventually the downfall is inevitable, it's not inevitable today, right? We're always kind of trying to reverse the decline. We're like doctors, trying to prolong the life of the good things that we believe in, like America or Western culture, for instance. So this corruption, let's say, of Christianity. I mean, what you're saying, Aravir, it sounds very much like Nietzsche. And in some ways, this analysis of the corruption of Christianity is a lot like Nietzsche. And I've just been reading this other philosopher, Del Noce, who writes about this as well, that, when Christianity becomes just a softening force, then it starts to look like a slave mentality. Slave morality is what Nietzsche called it, right? It's just this kind of way of inverting values so that weak people can glorify over the strong. And it's, in that sense, it's just another Thrasimikian power grab, right? It's just another effort to structure the world so that your team wins. And this is a very powerful critique of a certain form of decadent Christianity. It's similar in many ways to how Machiavelli regarded the church of his day, although with some changes for a time period, right? But the idea that, like, when the church becomes corrupt, then it becomes a sort of shadow version of itself. I do think that, like, this obsession that we have with victims and with not only respecting and loving victims, but with wanting to become victims, right? This is a kind of corruption of turn the other cheek, because what Christianity does is it steps into the logic of the ancient world, which is the logic of the world, right? Which is just the strong survive, right? The strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. Steps into that logic and says, no, God identifies with the weak and loves and preserves the weak. And his eye is upon the weak. And what you do unto them represents what you do unto God, right? The way that you behave toward the beggar, the way that you behave toward the hungry, the naked, ultimately that expresses your attitude toward God. And every heresy, every corruption of Christianity is just taking some portion of Christianity without the rest. And so what we've done is we've said, well, God loves the lowly, and we want to be loved by God, so let's become the lowly, right? And what Jesus says is something a little bit different. He says, you are already beloved of God. And so release your desire to earn God's love and simply love those whom God loves, right? The point of the Good Samaritan, the point of the, person in need, the point of the victim, is not to try to make yourself into the biggest victim you can be, but to seek out the real victims whom you can help and to have that heart for people. And there's no getting away from that, right? I mean, my dad and I were talking about this in his show. He has this idea that, Christianity is the truth. And so anything that kind of moves away from it is just a corruption. It's just moving backward. It's not moving forward. But there is a way in which, right, especially with Marx, right, Marx, who kind of takes this concern for the downtrodden and makes it into a totalizing theory of the world, that the proletarian shall rise up, right? without acknowledging the parts of Christianity that say, well, it's not your job to become that guy. It's your job to help that guy, right? And to be, insofar as we become lowly as Christians, we do so to help others, right? And so it's actually weirdly selfish, right? This identification with the victim, because it says, well, if the victim is who gets all the goodies in a Christian society, then I'm going to become the victim as a way of getting the goodies, right? And so weirdly, Nietzsche's observation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It does become a kind of slave morality, right? That teaches people to seek objection, not because objection, is somehow holy, but because objection gets you goodies. And that's kind of, I think, what Marx has done to Christianity. And my answer to how to resolve this is the way to resolve all heresies, which is to put it back into the context of the whole gospel, all of the gospel, right? And so when you really read all the gospels, Jesus isn't a wilting flower at all. Jesus takes a whip to the tables of the money changers in the temple, right? Jesus gets mad and comes to bring not peace but a sword, right? All of these kind of confident assertions that Jesus makes, right? We have to stop associating Christianity with just this kind of weak delicacy. Christianity is a robust and strong love for the broken, right? Christianity is so strong that it can actually stand in between the world and the broken and take the blows of the world, right? That's the whole point of Jesus, and that's the whole point of being a disciple of Jesus. And there is, I think it's a Teddy Roosevelt quote. I can't remember who says this. Ryan Mickler on the Order of Man podcast is always quoting this idea that the good man stands between his family and the world, absorbing the blows of fate, and that's kind of the proper idea of Christian victimology, is that God identifies with the victim, and so pour out your heart onto the victim. Don't become the victim yourself in a sort of cynical ploy to get the goodies. So Marxism has been often called the last heresy. I think there's a lot to that, and I think our neo-Marxism, our cultural Marxism, is basically just another perversion of this idea that because the weak are beloved of God, therefore we should all desire to become weak. And if you read the gospel, that's not what it's about at all. Because the weak are beloved of God, we should desire to be strong in defense of the weak. That's the kind of, I think, the answer to heresy is always the whole gospel.